My name is Leslie Nabin, and I actually recently just moved institution, so I'm now from the Open University, where I work in environmental systems. And I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so about COP26 and about international climate change action. So I'm just going to explain a bit about what this thing called COP26 is and why it matters, and also some of the other things that are going on in the climate change space. And the aim in doing so is just to explain a bit about what these processes are, how they work, and why they're important. So I'll aim to talk for about 20 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards or during. So as you might have kind of learned in the webinars and things you maybe did at the end of last year, this is backdrop to all of this is some kind of lofty and ambitious looking targets for avoiding dangerous levels of climate change. And these are just numbers. They tend to be sort of picked because they're nice round numbers, and there's also a scientific basis for them to keep carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere to below 450 parts per million, and also to keep warming globally well below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. And again, there's also links here to the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, on climate action and cities and communities and life on land. So that's what all of this is about, and all of what it's aiming for. But what I suppose is COP26? How does it come about, and why is it important? So the United Nations has this convention on climate change. It's one of the kind of secretariats, one of the many things the United Nations does. And it sets the framework for treaties and things that are legally binding when it comes to the global response on climate change. And they have their headquarters, their secretariat in Bonn in Germany. And part of the way that this thing, the UNFCCC as we call it, part of the way that this works is that they have annual meetings to assess essentially the world's progress towards responding to climate change. And these annual meetings are called the COP, the Conference of the Parties. And so they have one of these more or less every year. Because of COVID, the one that was held in Glasgow was postponed for a year, but essentially they have these every year. And some of the kind of important ones along the way. So in 1997 in Kyoto, there was an agreement that was made to legally binding targets for emissions reductions. Then in Paris in 2015, this legally binding agreement was made to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and ideally below 1.5 degrees. And what had happened in Glasgow, or what was supposed to happen in Glasgow, was that this would be the first COP meeting that would review and update what countries said they were going to do, and actually where the different nations would hopefully come to agreement on how they put these agreements into practice. So that was what was happening in Glasgow at COP26. It was the latest meeting of the different countries that sign up to the UN framework for climate change to agree on where they'd got to and agree how they were going to put what they'd agreed thus far into practice. And so that was back in 2016. This was this Paris Agreement, this aim to keep warming to well below 2 degrees. This being ratified. So COP26, as Leslie said in the introduction, I was there as an observer through the Open University, and I'll explain a bit more about what that means. And that was held in Glasgow at the start of November. The United Kingdom held the presidency, and in fact the UK still holds the presidency in association with Italy, and it will hold it for the whole of this year until the next COP, the next annual meeting, which will happen at the end of this year, which will be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And why that's so important, as I say, it's been 5 years since the Paris Agreement, once you put the COVID break in, and so it's the first point where countries were going to update and increase what they said they were all going to do to stop harmful levels of climate change from happening. So broadly speaking, there were 4 goals for COP26. One was to agree to keep 1.5 degrees of warming within reach and to secure essentially zero carbon dioxide emissions by the middle of the century. Another was the other side of this coin, which was to agree on how we were going to adapt to climate change. And then there was also these questions about finance and who is going to pay, and particularly to get the richer countries in the world to agree to support the less well-off countries to deal with the various climate threats that they face. And also there was all this business about cooperation, working together to deliver and to finalise, how they're actually going to do this in practice. So as I say, I was an observer at COP, which meant I got to go and sit and I got to go and look at stuff. And a really interesting experience, because what I learned was that the way in which the decisions are actually made is quite opaque, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on that the public and indeed the media doesn't really get access to. So what you might have seen on social media, what you might have seen on the news and things like this, are these kind of what are these called, these big plenary sessions, and you have Alok Sharma up at the gavel, up at the table, and everybody sitting in all the different countries speaking. You might think that's where the real negotiations happen, but it's not. That's where some of the important stuff happens. But when it comes down to actually negotiating the treaties, the agreements that they make, that tends to happen in smaller and smaller and smaller sessions that get more and more and more closed and less and less and less open to public scrutiny. So you have these big plenary sessions where everybody talks, but then you have, for the different bits of the agreement, you have these things that are called informal sessions. And what happens is they break out into small groups. As you notice, there's not 177 people in the room. There's not every country in there. So what sometimes countries will work in blocks and they'll send a representative. And essentially what happens is each of these little informal groups will work on one bit of the text. This was a group working on the paragraphs on science and research. Then there's other paragraphs on financing, things like that. These will happen in these little informal sessions. Again, this though isn't really where the actual wording gets discussed. That happens in what are weirdly enough called informal sessions. Now, this is not a photo from inside the room, and there's a reason for that. And that is that a lot of the informal sessions, which is where the real horse trading happens, these are closed to observers, they're closed to the media. Often these are only open to country representatives and delegates, and they're held at very short notice and sometimes at very weird times of the day. And most of all, what you get, and if you were watching the live streams, you might have seen this, where the real discussion and where the real kind of power brokering happens, it actually tends to be in these informal huddles. Sometimes they might be in the negotiation rooms, sometimes they might be in corridors where people from different countries will actually just negotiate in small groups to agree on wording of text. And sometimes it can be huge discussions over where a semicolon goes or changing just one word. Now, it can really boil down to that. But the key thing to take away is that these big kind of negotiations, as are bits that you might see, often aren't where a lot of the discussion, the kind of real negotiation happens. A lot of that, weirdly enough, happens but kind of behind closed doors. But you also have all this other stuff that's going on at COP as well. So you have side events, and some of these are kind of big rooms where you have maybe a sort of talk show type setting. So these are where, your Barack Obamas and your Leonardo DiCaprios and your David Attenboroughs, they'll come and they'll give a nice speech and people will take applause and, they'll take photos and things. That's the stuff that gets a lot of the attention from the media. But if you're being a bit cynical, you could say it's actually of limited consequence when it comes to thinking about what actually goes into the text of the agreements. You also have a kind of weird trade show type setting, where you have these national pavilions where each country can sort of have a pavilion where they showcase what they're doing for climate change, and they can have their own little talk events. And funnily enough, the countries that you might expect to be least positive on climate change action tend to have the biggest pavilions. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, have this big jazzy two-tier pavilion where they had a whole series of seminars, including this wonderfully titled A Realist Approach to Carbon Management. And I'll leave it up to your imagination to decide what a realist approach to carbon management looks like. Qatar as well had this big jazzy shiny pavilion where they had little models of all of their World Cup stadiums too. So, you know, there's all this kind of front and all this show, but it tends to be in these kind of very closed and sort of secretive negotiations that the real, you know, that's where the real kind of power brokering and the real horse trading happens. And, you know, you might remember, and I'll say more about this in a second, that that's what happened right at the end of COP. So, as I say, well, how does all this work? You know, what's all this about? So, as part of the UN framework process, each country has to produce something which is called an intended nationally determined contribution. Basically, it's a document that says, for each country, says this is what we are going to do to contribute to keeping emissions as low as possible and also adapting to climate change. And every 5 years, countries have to update these and increase their ambition. The idea being that, you know, we keep cranking up the ambition and do more and more over time. So some research has been done, some analysis has been done of what's in these pledges, and it was originally suggested around 2015 that we'd still be on track for 3.5 degrees of warming, so quite a lot of warming, if we just took what was in the pledges. More recent research has suggested actually we're maybe closer to about 2 degrees or 2.4 of warming if you just take what countries have said they're going to do. So it's still not enough, but it is an improvement. And, you know, these are the kind of things that guide what countries say they're going to do, and that they submit this as part of the process. They're not very exciting to look at. This is Japan's one, for example. This is Vietnam's. But, you know, they are all publicly available. They're uploaded. They go into a UN website, and anybody can look and see what's in them. And if you've got, I mean, just thinking about teaching, I've used these with master's level students. And if you've got very capable or keen younger groups of pupils, it might be something you can get them to look at, just the different things and the different priorities that different countries have, because you'll see lower income nations tend to prioritize more adapting to climate change and asking for support. For countries that emit more, it tends to be more about how they're going to reduce their emissions and the kind of technologies. So over time, this is what's being up. This is just a nice visual that I pulled off Climate Action Tracker, just to show how many countries have still to to update their pledges, and whose pledges increase ambition and whose don't. And you can see there are some differences there. So at COP26, what were they actually really discussing? So as I say, they've got all these negotiations, they've got all these different things, they've got all these different aspects to aim for. And the big questions, big things they were trying to work at, a lot of it was about, well, how do you pay for all of this? You know, particularly, how do you get the high emitting, the wealthier nations to agree to support the less well-off nations to make the changes that they need, and also to adapt to the impacts that are already being faced. There was a lot of this stuff about carbon markets, so how countries can share their emissions. And a really big one is the second point here, which is funding for loss and damage. And this is a really thorny issue that still hasn't been resolved, and they're still going to be duking it out at next year's negotiations. This is basically, how do you get the more well-off countries to compensate the poorer parts of the world for things that are going to be lost and things that are going to be damaged because of rising temperatures, more extreme events, storms, floods, and all the rest? That's a really big thorny issue. Still, the wealthiest countries won't agree to this. One of the concerns is that if they do, they could be open to huge billions and trillions of pounds of claims for the level of damage that climate change is causing. So, these are some of the kind of big negotiation points that are still being thrashed out. And the question often gets asked is, well, how successful was COP26? Depending on who you talk to, you get a lot of very different views on this. There's a lot of different opinions. And clearly some people who are maybe have quite radical and progressive views on the environment were very upset by the outcome and process at COP26. Others who are more pragmatic might point to some of the benefits that were made. And again, as I say, it depends who you talk to, you might hear different things. Nonetheless, it is true that there were things that were agreed. So countries agreed on some kind of rules for actually how they're going to put this agreement into practice, what they need to report, what they need to submit, how they're going to count emissions and things like that. They agreed on a common set of rules. For the first time ever, we had an agreement text that actually mentioned coal as a fossil fuel, and that's a big thing to actually have in text that it explicitly mentions coal. Having said that, at the last minute, the wording was changed from phasing out coal to phasing down coal. Now, as I say, a lot of people were quite upset about that. The flip side of that, though, is that it doesn't mention oil and gas. And the countries that rely on oil and gas are the richer countries. The EU have seen this with the Ukrainian, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that the big concern is, well, how do you wean off Russian gas? The issue for richer countries is oil and gas, not coal. And so there's been a bit of contention there. Well, for countries like India that rely quite heavily on coal for electricity, you say, well, actually, the coal power is still part of their their development plan, and it has an important role in poverty alleviation. So maybe it's not quite right that we single the Indian government out for criticism for forcing that change, for requesting that change at the last minute. So that's a big live issue too. And as I say, there's still no agreement on this thing about loss and damage and the compensation that richer countries need to pay to poorer countries. So enough about that. Just a bit as well about, well, how does that filter down to Scotland? How does that filter down to local level? So Scotland is, I'm not going to get into the debates and the rights and wrongs of this, but Scotland is not an independent country. Therefore, we're represented in the UNFCCC by the UK. Until Brexit, the UK was part of the EU, puts in a sort of joint declaration. But now, Scotland is represented by the UK. However, many aspects of the UK's climate change responses are devolved to the Scottish Government, and indeed also the Welsh Assembly and Northern Ireland. There are different bits that get devolved down to the different devolved administrations. So the Scottish Government's got its own plan for climate change, it's got its own plan for adapting to climate change, and they also made their own kind of indicative international contribution, which they made before COP26. And there were some interesting politics there. The UK government weren't really too happy about Scotland, and in particular Nicola Sturgeon, having quite a visible presence at COP26. They wanted to keep it as a UK government space. But nonetheless, the Scottish government, through devolved powers, is responsible for doing a lot of the things that need to happen for the UK, and for Scotland as part of the UK to meet its climate obligations. And what about local government? Well, local government is really important too. Local governments are very important for our climate change response, because that's where a lot of the rhetoric gets turned into reality. So things like planning, planning permission, planning consents for wind farms, land use, where things can go, building codes for things like energy efficiency, actually enforcing environmental regulations. All this stuff seems very mundane and everyday when you compare it to the big high-powered negotiations with Leo flying in and all this stuff, but it's really important because it's the councils, it's the local authorities that actually have to do the things that turn this into reality. And that's especially so when we're talking about adapting to the impacts of climate change and not just reducing our emissions. So where various parts of Scotland are now setting up local groups and strategies and partnerships for thinking about how to deal with climate change impacts. And one of the latest ones of these that's just been launched very recently is Highland Adapts. So across the Highlands, there's now this partnership, this group, which is moving towards thinking about how we help the Scottish Highlands to deal with more extreme weather and flooding and heat waves and all the rest. So the local government level has a critical and often underappreciated role to play in meeting these targets. I'm just going to say another couple of things very quickly because I'm aware I've already been talking for just over 20 minutes. So I'm just going to flag up another couple of things that happen that are important as well. And so one is that we do have a whole parallel set of processes, a whole parallel set of negotiations which aren't about climate change, but are about biodiversity. So there's this thing called the Convention on Biological Diversity, how we protect flora, fauna, plants, animals, genetic resources, and all the rest. That's got its own set of negotiations, and treaties and science, all of that as well. It doesn't get as much attention, but it's also very important because we can't exist without the natural environment. Protecting biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, all of that is really important because that's the kind of building blocks for our society, for our economy. It's the building blocks for everything that we want, particularly soaking up carbon emissions from trees and things, using sand dunes, things like that to guard against erosion. Healthy environments, healthy biodiversity is very important for what we need to be a climate resilient and healthy society. So these processes are happening too in parallel. They don't always get the same attention as the climate processes, but they are exceedingly important. And so I just wanted to finish as well by explaining a little bit about another kind of acronym that you might have seen a lot of in the news, and that is the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so you might have seen a report came out recently about the state that the planet's in and how quickly we need to ask. And these reports, they're produced by another part of the United Nations, and it doesn't do science, but it reviews and assesses some of the most recent high quality, top quality science and social science information and puts these into assessment reports. And so these come out periodically. And so you might see different things at different times, all giving us different kinds of bad news, but they all tell us slightly different things. So they have different working groups. One, and this is the one that always comes out first, they have a working group on physical science. And so that tells us what's happening. And that's like the hardcore science, the ice sheets, the ocean currents, the things like that. That tells us what is happening. Then we had a second group that produced a report a couple of months ago. And that's about impacts and vulnerability. And basically that's, well, how is climate change affecting people? And then we had a third one, which came out just the other week. And that's about stopping climate change happening and what we can do about it. And that was the one that got a lot of news coverage just a week or so ago, saying, well, society has to act really fast. We're running out of time. But also the positive spin on that, we already have a lot of the technologies that we need. We already have most of the knowledge, most of the technical expertise we need to stop climate change from happening to harmful extent. What we need now is the political will to make that happen. And the IPCC does these assessments periodically. They go through cycles, so they keep updating it, and they sometimes do special reports as well. So, sometimes you'll see different things that will tell you different bits. That's why it's because they do these reports in sequence, and they go in cycles, and, they follow these patterns. So again, like, if you've got pupils that are maybe asking, well, why is this report just saying bad news? You can say, well, the reports work in a sequence, and each report tells us a different bit. And sometimes you have to wait a little bit before they tell you the report that tells you what you want to hear, if that makes sense. So the IPCC, they do these different projections of emissions based on what the science says, all of which basically tell us that we do need urgent and rapid action. And just to say briefly, as I said, don't forget as well, you've got all the biodiversity and ecology things too, which are super important. Again, they don't get the attention, but there is another parallel process called the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform, biodiversity and ecosystem services, which is a real mouthful. It also produces assessment reports, which looks at, again, biodiversity. And they have a very strong interest in how you bring in traditional knowledge, local knowledge from indigenous people, and how you might, integrate that and consider that alongside peer-reviewed, scholarly and scientific knowledge. So just to wrap up then, a few things. So COP processes, they're very important. They tend to be a bit opaque, but they're not the only way that climate action happens. You've got these international negotiations, but you also have things that happen nationally and locally, which are really important. That's where the rubber hits the road. And it can be very easy, I think, to get depressed sometimes about how procedural and how slow and how parochial these negotiations are. It's worth remembering that, they're not the only thing that's going on. Maybe sometimes we have to realize we can't expect too much of these processes if we don't have that kind of will politically at national level to take radical climate action. And also you have all these things around biodiversity as well, which are also really important. So hopefully that's given a bit of a sense of kind of what COP is and how it was received and why it's important and how it works. I'll stop there. I'd be really happy to take any questions that you might have, but thanks very much for your attention.